Get started here. So good evening, everyone. My name is Lauren Arsenault, and I'll be moderating this evening's stakeholder meeting for the Township of Springwater's official plan review. Thank you to the attendees who have joined this meeting. This meeting will be live streamed to the Township's YouTube channel and will be available for viewing on YouTube after the meeting has ended. This evening, we will be hearing a presentation from the Township's Consultants, WSP. If you've joined online, you will have the opportunity to submit any questions you may have related to the presentation or the draft reports WSP has prepared through the Q&A function located at the bottom of the screen. Please ensure you state your name, agency, if applicable, and address before typing your question out and submitting. I will either read the questions aloud for the consultants to answer live, or you will be provided with a written response from Township staff through the Q&A function. You may type a question anytime during the meeting, and we will take breaks throughout the presentation to answer questions, and any remaining questions will be addressed after the presentation has finished. I will pass it off to Greg from WSP now. Thank you.
Thanks, Lauren, and good evening, everyone. As Lauren mentioned, my name is Greg Bender from WSP, the firm retained to work with the Township on the official plan review. We also worked with Watson and Associates on one of the background studies, and I'll certainly walk you through that. With me this evening, we also have Matt Alexander, who's going to be speaking on a couple of the background studies, as well as John Taziopoulos, who's going to be walking you through the corridor study. Next slide, please, Matt. So again, just to walk through a bit of the agenda, I'm going to talk to you about the format and purpose of the meeting, an overview of the work program, talk to you about the three background studies, the population-related employment market study intensification strategy, and the corridor study. Talk about next steps, and certainly I would argue the most important part of this evening's session is the question and answer, question and discussion. And as Lauren mentioned, there's one way to offer your questions and comments. They will be either be responded by myself or our team or Township staff. We will do our best to answer them tonight, but if we don't have the ability to answer them tonight, we will certainly get back to you in a timely manner because we are going to record all questions and answers and provide responses to those. Next slide, please, Matt. So we want to give you a bit of an update on the official plan review, where we are and where we're going as part of this process. We're going to give you updates on the background studies, as I mentioned, and obviously to provide or to obtain input from all of you tonight and to talk to you about next steps and how to stay engaged in the process. Next slide. So for those of you who've been staying in touch as part of this particular project, this has been split into two phases. Phase one was the preparatory work, and phase two is really sort of drafting the official plan. As part of phase one, there was a communication strategy that was prepared, and that really sort of outlined the tactics that are used as part of this particular project, how various groups, stakeholders, members of the public, council are to be engaged in the process, and how input would be gathered, how meetings could be set up, things like that. There were visioning workshops that were organized and held to obtain input on, the overall vision for the municipality, some issues to be addressed through the process, and really to set the tone for the preparation of any background work and then the drafting of the official plan. There was a draft discussion paper and a draft growth management strategy that were prepared to really understand where the municipality is going with respect to growth, how much land is needed to conform to the county's official plan. The draft discussion paper really studied issues in a bit more detail to provide sort of a narrative to support the work that we're doing right now as part of phase two. There's a public open house that was held and a Section 26 meeting, which is a statutory meeting under the Planning Act that allows council members of the public to provide input into the process, to identify any issues that should be addressed, and to also sort of formalize the process and really kick off the process to preparing the official plan. So as part of phase two, we're now, as you can see from the arrow, we're now in the process of preparing the background reports. So that's why we're here tonight, to talk to you about those background reports. Once those background reports have been finalized, and we'll talk to you a bit about that process later in the presentation, we're going to start preparing the draft official plan, have a public open house, sort of cluster meeting similar to what we're having right now. We're going to meet with stakeholders and council as well. Finalize the official plan based on input received, and then have a statutory public meeting again to talk about the overall process, how the official plan has changed and how the input that has been submitted has been influencing the project. And then once we have that, any additional input will be considered, and then looking forward to council adoption shortly thereafter. Next slide, please. So the next sort of 3 sets of slides are going to talk about the background study. So they're going to be the population related employment market study first, then the intensification strategy, and then the corridor study. And now I'm going to turn it over to Matt Alexander.
Thanks, Greg, and good evening, everybody. I'm going to try to share my video. There I am. Nice to meet you. So I'm going to discuss the population-related employment market study that was prepared by Watson & Associates in support of the project. There we are. So the purpose and objectives of this study were to assess if there is an adequate amount of designated lands to accommodate population-related employment growth in Springwater to the year 2031. Population-related employment refers to lands with mixed use, commercial, or institutional land uses on them. And in Springwater, that represents approximately 75% of employment lands. Essentially, it's the types of employment that serve the local population. You think of it that way. The purpose of the study was also to provide direction on the types of commercial and institutional uses anticipated over the planning horizon, as well as where within the urban settlement area, and to identify the magnitude of commercial growth that can be expected in a more long-term scenario beyond the year 2031, based on the anticipated build-out of the Midhurst secondary plan area and greenfield lands in the township. Some of the market considerations that went into this analysis include the commercial potential in Elmvale related to tourism and visitors, and serving the population beyond the township, so people who might come in to make use of those businesses. Also, high vacancy rate. There's a high vacancy rate of approximately 17% among these land uses. And for reference, a healthy vacancy rate in a balanced market is typically between 5 to 10%. So it's slightly higher, somewhat higher vacancy rate than you would generally want to see. Vacant space is primarily concentrated in the downtown area of Elmvale and within the Midhurst Bayfield corridor. Proximity to an established retail base within the city of Barrie and significant outflow of spending is also a key consideration. So the fact that the Bayfield Street corridor is just north of an established commercial area in Barrie. Population-related employment represents the largest employment sector of the local employment base, and so that's why it's important to plan for this appropriately in the official plan. Part of the study looked at the demand for population-related employment uses. So the township of Springwater has approximately 233,000 square feet of occupied retail and service commercial space, and approximately 48,000 square feet of vacant retail space. It's anticipated that by 2031, the population will have grown to support about 286,000 square feet of commercial space in Midhurst and 62,000 square feet of commercial space within Elmvale. The total land requirement to accommodate population-related employment uses by 2031 is approximately 60 hectares, which is less than the designated land vacant supply, so less than what currently exists, which is approximately 156 hectares. And what that means is that the commercial space demand anticipated within Midhurst, for example, is more than 4 times the existing occupied commercial space. And so the second part that I'm going to speak about now is the intensification strategy that we've written. I don't know, Greg, if you wanted to add anything.
No, I think you've covered everything, Matt. I think the intent, and Lauren, correct me, is to see if there's any specific questions related to the first
sure.
Sort of study, or would you like us to continue?
Yes, thank you, Greg. We should take a minute here and we'll just give the attendees the opportunity to type any questions if they have any relating to that the first study. So if you do have a question, I'd like for you to please put it in the Q&A function, which is located at the bottom of the screen. And you can type it out there, and then we will relay that to the consultants for a response. Okay, I don't see any questions right now, but you can type them at any time during the meeting, and we will respond to them. And if it has to do with this study, then we'll get back to it at the end of the meeting. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, it's kind of a lot to consider. The report goes into much more detail, and it gets fairly complex. It's written by economists who spend a lot of time. I do see that there is something in the Q&A. Maybe we can go to that. Would that make sense?
Yes, thank you. Yes.
Okay.
So we do have one question now from Jasmina. Jasmina, if you could just provide your full name and address, that would be great. But she's asking, how did you study the Midhurst Bayfield Street North from Snow Valley to Carson Road for commercial benefits?
Oops, sorry. So we'll be talking about the area that the corridor study covers in the third section of this presentation. So I think we'll come to that at that point.
Excellent. Yes,
yeah.
we'll get to that, Jasmina. And if you still have questions after that last section of the presentation, you can type them out again. Okay.
But thanks for bringing that up, because now we'll be prepared to respond to that.
Thank you.
And it looks like there's a second one.
I think she's referring to her address, which is 1060 Bayfield Street, North Midhurst, Ontario, and she did not see that address in the study.
Yes, and we've received her comments, so we're aware of the comments that she's previously already submitted on this. So we will be able to respond to that. And I think for now, we're going to try to focus on the employment section. The next part will be the intensification strategy, and the third part is going to be the corridor study, which I think is what's most relevant to that question.
Excellent.
If there's anything, yeah.
Thank you. And one other question from Simon Seif. Does your study conclude that no commercial land is needed?
It essentially shows that there is an existing surplus of population-related employment lands. So this would be separate from something like a major employment use that is bringing in, or let's say is exporting product, something like manufacturing or processing facility or something like that. But as far as retail, service commercial space, institutional uses, those kinds of jobs, what the study is showing is that there is an excess of lands required. If something happens and the population exceeds the forecasts, then that might change things. Or if there are planning applications or changes of uses over time, of course that can all change. But from what we're looking at right now, and I would say too that I'm not the author of this study. Our partners in this, Watson and Associates, authored the study, and like I mentioned, their report goes into a lot more detail about this, and you might find some nuances there that we haven't captured in this summary for the presentation. I'm not sure if you had anything to add, Craig.
No, I think you've covered it. I think if there's additional questions related to this, let's hold them until after the corridor study, because I think we might be able to answer some of it then. And certainly if we have not answered the question that you have adequately, we will certainly go back as it relates to this particular study and speak to our friends at Watson to get you the answer you're looking for.
Yes. And then you can, of course, submit more detailed questions as well. So if there's a particular reason that you're asking for that, then we can respond a bit more with a bit more detail. So if there's nothing else that's directly related to this section, then I suppose I'll move on.
Thank you.
Okay. So the next section is about the intensification strategy. The purposes and objectives of this were to confirm the residential intensification opportunities within the township to meet the requirements of the County of Simcoe official plan. So the growth plan for the Greater Golden Horseshoe and the County of Simcoe official plan both establish intensification targets that the township of Springwater is required to meet. So our strategy identifies strategic growth areas, which are areas where we want to focus new growth. It investigates the ability of the township to service and facilitate development of strategic growth areas. And what that means is making sure that there's enough water and sewer treatment capacity to accommodate additional population. We looked at supporting opportunities for intensification in general throughout the township and determining general policies, principles, and concepts for massing and urban design within those specific intensification areas. And we also looked at assisting with community engagement to better understand the shift to a more compact built form and a more diverse range and mix of housing options, resulting from achieving higher rates of intensification. And part of that is this meeting tonight. So we want to be able to help the residents understand where the strategy is coming from, what sort of options we're looking at, and how that might be implemented and what it could look like in the future, so that you don't, open up the computer one day, look at the Facebook page and be surprised by new policies that might be recommended. So we're trying to give you the basis for our reasoning here. So some of the considerations with this intensification strategy is that there is a requirement from the County of Simcoe that there is 15% of growth is intensified. Sorry, that there's an intensification target of 15% within the built-up areas of Elmville and Midhurst. This does not include lands outside of the built boundary. So of course, there's still going to be some development that takes place there. And the reason for that is that moving forward, the township will only be able to direct intensification to the red areas I'm going to show you on the next map. And I'll explain that a little bit more as well. So this map shows the southern portion of the township, and the areas identified in yellow represent what's called undelineated built-up boundaries. And what that means is that these are areas where people live and there's built-up development, but for the purposes of the growth plan, they're not considered to be delineated. So they're not sort of planned for a lot of new growth and new intensification in these areas. The red areas are considered delineated built-up areas within the growth plan, and that's where the direction is to direct more development, essentially to ensure that municipal services can be provided more efficiently, and that existing facilities can be made use of instead of having to build new facilities outside of these areas. And what you can see here is we've done an analysis of the land that's designated for residential development. And what we found is approximately, well, the numbers represent how many new residential units can be accommodated on lands that are currently designated for residential uses. And you can see that there's a large number that's available in the yellow areas, those undelineated built-up areas, and very few space available within Midhurst, for example, which is considered a delineated built-up area and is supposed to take all that new development. And it's the same story on the north side of the township, where Phelpston and Anson Mills and Hillsdale have more land designated for residential use than Elmvale in terms of vacant land that's not already developed. And so the purpose of the intensification strategy is to find ways of directing more of that new development that we're projecting over the next few years into those red areas like Elmvale. And that's something that is being directed from the growth plan at the provincial level and will be implemented through the Simcoe County official plan as it gets updated as well. So what we found is our 2018 growth management strategy projected a need to accommodate 777 new units of residential development through intensification. So specifically through intensification to the year 2031. And based on what we showed in the maps just now, the township has a supply for 77 units in those intensification areas. So there's a bit of a gap there. Through things like the additional residential units program and the ability to add basement apartments or secondary suites in existing homes, there is some ability to increase that supply and accommodate more population. But it's not necessarily going to capture everything. So the intensification strategy identifies Midhurst more specifically as the focus for providing an additional supply for 700 units based on the servicing capacity that exists, the availability of vacant or underutilized land, the fact that it is a strategic growth location, it's well located for new growth, and it helps to implement growth plan direction and to anticipate the needs identified by the county municipal comprehensive review, so its program of updating its official plan. And our conclusions in the intensification strategy are we identified the Bayfield corridor in Midhurst as a strategic growth area within the township to focus intensification. And this will be discussed a bit more in the next section, but essentially it has larger plots of land that are vacant or underutilized and have high potential for redevelopment. We're also recommending new policies that would encourage and facilitate gentle intensification through the redevelopment of existing low-density properties. So that would be things like allowing semi-detached homes where only single detached homes exist right now, or maybe townhouses in certain areas. It's not about new 12-story buildings or high-rises or anything like that. It's about being able to split up some of those larger residential lots that exist, subject to other policies as well. We also recommend establishing policies to provide a framework for the division of estate residential lots within settlement areas where appropriate servicing exists. So this is a type of residential use that where there might be demand to create more units, and we wouldn't want to unnecessarily prevent that from happening. We're also recommending to update the policies of the Midhurst transitional residential designation. So that's sort of an in-between designation, but it only permits single detached dwellings right now. And so we're recommending that maybe we would want to permit a greater variety of housing types, like those singles or those semi-detached homes and duplexes, that sort of thing, within that specific designation. And we talk a little bit about providing financial or regulatory incentives for intensification, making it a little bit easier for people to split their lot if they want to. And now I'm going to pass it along. Oh no, we'll do the questions. So I suppose if there's any questions, we can on this section we can address that now.
Excellent, thank you. I don't have any questions right now, but we'll just give the attendees a minute. Again, the Q&A function is located at the bottom of the screen, and you can type any questions that you have. so I have another question from Jasmina. If you will be including 1060 Bayfield Street North in your final official plan to make sure that I would not be overlooked.
Well, I suppose we can probably address that now. We'll be going right into it, but it's my understanding that that property has an existing designation that reflects the use that's there. And we are not proposing any changes to that. So we're not proposing to limit the development relative to what's permitted right now, or limit the uses that are permitted right now. I hope that that answers response to those concerns. I don't know if we've specifically identified that in the draft, but that is something that we will be refining and making sure that we have the appropriate designations on all the properties that exist. So thank you for bringing that to our attention. And I think we don't have any disagreement on that. We're happy to make sure that the existing use permissions continue with this update.
And if I could just add to that as well, we'll certainly be working with Brent and other township staff to make sure that we've got, as Matt said, the right designations on the right properties. And certainly if there's any refinements needed through the process, we can certainly consider that again in discussions with township staff.
And just a follow up from Jasmina, she was wondering if she could build a senior's home on the property.
And I think we'd want to just defer that. And I think any individual property questions, it's certainly something we can talk about, but I think we might want to take that sort of outside of this particular forum when we've got the information to respond appropriately. And certainly, I know you're in discussions with township staff, and they certainly are the experts as it relates to what the existing permissions are and what might be reasonable. So continue that discussion for sure.
Thank you, Greg. Okay, so we have another question from Russ Logan, 1433 St. Vincent Street. He's asking for clarification if no apartment buildings in the plans. If yes, where?
We're not defining the type of intensification to happen. Now, that being said, I'm going to suggest that conversation wait until after the corridor study presentation happens, because there's going to be some discussion about sort of the type of development that could be accommodated along Bayfield.
Thank you. A question from Stephanie. There's currently empty buffer land close to the Barrie border, Bayfield shopping area. What is the purpose of keeping it empty? It's really close to Midhurst, but currently outside of the settlement area.
I'm going to defer this to township staff, but I will say that the whole discussion about buffers is somewhat outside of the municipality's control. It's something that I believe was imposed through the county to ensure that development does not run straight through from Barrie into Midhurst, as an example.
Okay, Brent, can you provide a little more background on that?
Yes, thank you. My understanding is that the purpose of the buffer, known as the Greenbelt buffer within the township, was initially set in place to avoid any further annexations and the movement of encroachment of Barrie into Springwater. The lands have been identified as lands through the background study to remain restricted to agricultural uses. Non-agricultural uses, new non-agricultural uses are restricted still through the policy, and the intention is to, under that policy, is to maintain that clear and identifiable buffer between the city of Barrie and the urban areas of Springwater.
Thank you. A question from Heidi McElwain. How much of the 156 hectares of available commercial land is in Midhurst and on vacant lands?
Thanks for that. If I can go back to the earlier section, I should be able to give you that breakdown. So where do we have that? Yeah, so in the first bullet here, what we have is a figure of 48,000 square feet or 4,500 square meters of vacant retail space. That is mainly divided between Elmvale and Midhurst. And I believe for Midhurst, the majority of that is on vacant, or what we say underutilized land. So development that's very low density, or maybe it's surrounded by vacant land on the same property, that kind of thing, where there's an opportunity for redevelopment or infill development on the lot. So I would say a high percentage of the land that is designated for commercial uses in Midhurst is vacant, or it's underutilized.
Thank you. Question from Armstrong Strategy Group. Are you planning on using urban design guidelines to ensure intensified development adds to the character of the community instead of detracts from it? If so, are you considering architectural control or other ways to prevent poor quality architecture and materials?
I think in some case I might want to defer this to Brent, but I will say as it relates to intensification on the Bayfield corridor, the answer is yes. As it relates to architectural control, I think that's something that we'll have to discuss a bit more with staff to determine if that's a tool that they'd like to use. I know it's used in many other municipalities, so it's something that we can certainly discuss.
Thank you.
I think just to answer the point there regarding the guidelines to ensure intensification, I think that the aim of any urban design guideline, especially when dealing with the corridor area, is to try to have development that does add to the community characteristics. The intention, I think, through the process is to ensure that everything is of high quality design. I don't think it's, from my standpoint, that it's, conducive to have your run-of-the-mill type commercial development along the corridor. And I think that we will be looking for added features and architectural controls to make sure that it's development of the highest quality.
Thank you, Director Spagnol. Okay, so from Hale Mahan at 33 Hillview Crescent, Midhurst, would intensification of residential units be allowed within Midhurst or just in the Bayfield corridor?
Matt, maybe I'll just answer that one first, and then you could fill in as if I miss anything. The intent is that, as Matt mentioned, the intent is that the majority of intensification is going to be directed to the Bayfield corridor. Certainly, there will be opportunities for some of that gentle intensification throughout. Matt mentioned second units as an example. So if somebody has a basement and they want to convert that into an apartment, that's something that certainly would be in theory through the process be permitted. But certainly, it would have to go through a particular process to understand what's reasonable and if it fits within the character of the area, as an example. But for the most part, the majority of the intensification in Midhurst will be along Bayfield corridor.
Yes, that's what. So the purpose of the strategy and the planning framework is that we're planning to direct most of the growth and to accommodate the most of that growth in the corridor. At the same time, where there are opportunities for, a few units here and there with undeveloped residential lots in other parts of Midhurst, or areas that are, like I mentioned, significantly larger lots where there's an opportunity for a homeowner to maybe create a new rental unit, or apply and build a semi-detached home or something like that. We wouldn't want to unnecessarily constrain that because there is this need to accommodate growth in the future. but we're not sort of trying to direct a wholesale kind of redevelopment of the neighborhoods.
Okay, thank you. A follow-up question from Jasmina. Still would like to know why your study only went from Snow Valley Road to Curry Drive on the north side, and on the south side, your study went from Carson to Finley Mill Road.
Can I just answer that, Greg?
Sure.
Jasmina, I know your concern. I've seen the information you provided to the town. That's an oversight on my part. When we were doing the analysis of the corridor, we're trying to identify areas that were not within the environmental areas. And for some reason, some of the mapping and the initial mapping, it was showing a lot of that as green, and that's why it wouldn't have been included. I can see now from the mapping, the most current mapping we have is that the boundary itself has not been extended further down. As Matt explained earlier, it does not preclude you from the permissions that you already have, that you have through those zoning permissions here, doesn't preclude any of that stuff. The corridor study is exactly that. It's a corridor study, but it is an oversight that we're going to correct in the next go around. You won't see anything that looks like a senior's home, but you will see some that shows basically how the building should be oriented and relate to the street frontages, whether that's Curry or whether that's Bayfield. So my apologies if this caused you a lot of stress, but there was no intention in that. So I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. Follow-up question from Stephanie. Just said I'm not sure I understand how a buffer zone prevents an annexation. So she's talking about the green belt again. Many towns and cities in Ontario have no buffer zones and there's no annexation. Could you expand? Thanks.
Thanks, Lauren. Yeah, and all I was doing was providing an outline of how the green belt was established and why it was established back when the official plan was brought into place. So I'm not arguing that, and I wouldn't argue that there are not any other situations where such green belts are utilized to avoid expansions. I was simply indicating as to what the origin of the green belt was and what the policy serves to do. In essence, as I said, it's meant now to serve as almost a physical difference or an identifier that you're actually leaving the city of Barrie and moving into the township of Springwater. And the way the policy exists right now, it really does restrict land uses to either existing non-agricultural uses, and it restricts new non-agricultural uses. I was just simply providing the origin of why the green belt was established within the current official plan.
Thank you, Brent. From Tiziano Zaghi, for residents who are not planners, could you please define what is intensification and give examples?
It's a good question, and apologies. We often forget that our jargon that we use is not always common knowledge. So apologies for that. Intensification can be looked at as anything that is being any development that's occurring within that delineated built-up area that Matt showed on the map. So those lands within the red boundary. So any development in there is considered intensification. It's often seen that it's typically going to be higher density than just a single detached dwelling. It's something like a second unit, as Matt mentioned. Even a semi-detached can be considered intensification, provided it's within that particular delineated built-up area. So it's really just any type of development that would occur within that area. Often intensification is often seen as something more dense than what's currently there. So if you have a bunch of single detached dwellings, intensification could be, in theory, a semi-detached, a townhouse, even a three-story walk-up. Not to suggest that's appropriate in every area, but that's just an example of intensification.
Thank you. Okay, that concludes the questions for now. Are we going to move on with the presentation?
Yes, thank you. So I will now hand it off to John Tassiopoulos to talk about the Bayfield Corridor Study.
Great. Thank you, Matt, and thank you for those who are attending the meeting virtually. Yeah, we conducted the just before we start, we conducted the corridor study, and when we were, as I mentioned to Jasmina earlier, there wasn't any intention on leaving certain properties out. What we were trying to do is avoid any properties that were within environmental areas. And so I'll go, and I know that, Jasmina, that it's not in the environmental area. I do understand that now. And as I said, our most recent mapping does show your property in particular correctly, and I think the property that's further south as well. Anyways, I'll explain in terms of the purposes and objectives. I mean, whenever you're dealing with a corridor study, part of the idea is how do you, for such a long, it's approximately 4 kilometers in length, the study area that we have. And so when you're trying to develop an overall plan, a framework, a vision for such a long corridor and such a wide corridor through Springwater, it takes a little bit of work, and there are certain assumptions you have to make when you're dealing with it. And when we're starting the work, the purpose and the objectives partly were from what the municipality had indicated to us through the proposal process, but also things that we understand from doing this type of work in other municipalities in Southern Ontario. So to start, the main sort of focus, and you're going to get that sense as we go through it, is one of the objectives was to support the major intersection at Bayfield, Snow Valley, and Finley Mill. That's an important and even a historical intersection within Midhurst. And so what we were sort of tasked with doing is understanding, when we've got such a long corridor, where should some of the focus be? And so one of the ideas was to establish a community focus that supports a community hub at this location, on the Hasty Track property. Another objective was to identify land uses considered appropriate for the high order community focus area, and I'll go through that as we go through it. And to identify generally some time horizons on how certain things how development along the corridor could be achieved over the near, the medium, and the long term. Another task we're given was understanding how we could accommodate a mix of retail, commercial, and residential uses that are pedestrian scaled, are supportive of active transportation. A little bit of a departure of what we see now along Bayfield, and having a more urban cross section. When I say urban cross section, I just mean that we have defined spaces with curbs, with pedestrian boulevards, and so on. That's what we mean when we say that. One of the other objectives was to establish appropriate intensification and higher density development forms. And when I say that in the process of dealing with the study, one of the things we're trying to also do is we're trying to test to understand if we could, what kinds of population and unit numbers we could accommodate within the corridor, given all the areas identified. What could they accommodate in a very conservative manner, so that we're not overstating the numbers. And so part of that you'll see is we took an approach where on the corridor itself, you're permitted 6-story buildings as of the sort of direction of the secondary plan, but we didn't do that. We went even for something a little bit lower than that, with the idea that 6 stories could still be achieved, but we wanted to show something that was we were conservative in our approach, that we weren't trying to overstate things. Another aspect was, right now there are multiple driveways and accessways off of Bayfield, which actually starts to quite compromise sort of the quality of that street frontage. So another idea was, how do we consolidate some of these access points and driveways? And then the final thing, and there was some comment being made earlier about whether there were guidelines and architectural control and so on. As Greg mentioned, that's something that we can discuss with the township further. But in terms of the guidelines, we are developing guidelines that will accompany the corridor study. They will be in an appendix of the study, and will be more specific. Because right now there are guidelines in place, and they are found in the secondary plan, but they're not specific to the corridor. They're for all of Midhurst secondary plan. Next slide, Matt.
Sorry about that.
So, yep. So in terms of the, as I was saying, it's quite a long area. So in order to be able to digest such a long space, one of the things we're tasked with doing were to consider some natural breaks. And as you can see, we've got three character areas that we've identified, and each of them has a slightly different. They're separated by a very strong either environmental area or an area that's already been developed and you know, it's not vacant or underutilized. So in terms of the three character areas, we further broke that down, and you can see it sort of in the lettering that you see there into 9 sub areas that were identified along the boundary. And then what you just saw pop up, the purple circle there, is identifying the Bayfield Center character area. And this is where a lot of the focus is going to be in the near and midterm. But in particular, what I want to focus on is right at the focal point. If you want to just click again, Matt, that indicates the intersection and what will be future community hub and recreational center that's envisioned for the I guess in this case it's the northwest side of northwest corner of the of that intersection. So this was an important thing in order. So what we're doing is we're going from the broad to the specific in this, and that's what we were trying to do. Is in the study, we talk about the whole area, but we get into the specifics of, you know, what would probably be developable first, where that should be focused, because the last thing you want to do is to have things spread out everywhere and not have any sort of cohesive focal point. And that's why it's very important to think about these particular areas that are surrounding that intersection. And again, I want to just sort of stress, I think I mentioned this earlier, that the study it's a forward-looking document that, and its intention is to provide a framework for what the Midhurst secondary plan identified as a mixed-use area within its own schedule. So, and a big part of this is just to test to see how it may develop over an extended period of time, and you know, what could it do? Again, as I mentioned, what could possibly be developed there in the near term as well. Next slide, Matt. So in order to do some of this work, in order to do the sort of the test and to develop some concepts for the corridor itself, there's certain assumptions, development assumptions that we made during the course of it, which you can sort of see on the left side there. And some of them, I'll just run through them very quickly, is that, you know, the lands within the corridor were all designated as mixed-use commercial in the secondary plan. And that's what we're focusing on, that we would look at only 4-story heights for the purpose of this analysis of concepts. It doesn't mean things are held to 4 stories. What I was trying to do is to use a very modest height, a very modest form of intensification to, and in this case, mixed use, to show what kind of, what number of units could be generated and how much retail space could be generated. Just something so that the township would have the ability to understand what the potential is and what's possible. The other thing that was important is that the parking in the area, we understand that in the near term, there's probably not the market to do below grade parking. It's always preferred. Some developers will do it as of right. But when we were developing, when we're saying 4-story buildings, it's because we're also quite aware of the parking requirements, and that a good chunk of that property will be taken up by at grade or above ground, above grade parking. So that's what we're trying to. That's one of the limiting factors in terms of showing smaller heights. We used a larger apartment gross floor area in order to determine the number of units that were generated, again, to not overstate how many units, but to show that at a very conservative level, you could achieve certain intensification targets. And again, the job yield calculation, what I mean by that is along the mixed use corridor, it's envisioned to have this continuous at grade retail along the corridor edges in those areas that we identified. And so when we were doing, typically you divide square meters or square footage by 30 or 300 and some odd square feet per job. In this case, we actually reduced that to say 1 per 60. So it's again a much more conservative number to show what that yield could be, and again not to overstate things. And then all of the properties that were included are all properties that are right adjacent to the corridor itself. They're adjacent to the corridor. We didn't go further into Midhurst Village. We didn't go further in the community because there was no need to do that. And most properties along Bayfield were at least 75 meters in depth, with the majority of them being close to 100. So that allows you to actually get a building and to get at grade parking behind that building in a very comfortable fashion. So with the exception, I think, of Area D, which are the Curry Truck Land Zone, which are much deeper properties. Everything else is pretty much along that edge. And then finally, an important part whenever you're developing an idea is not to forget parkland, not to forget park space or urban plazas or however you want to describe them, but places of respite along the corridor, because it's not just going to be one note where you have continuous buildings. There will be some visual relief, and what I mean by that is breaks in the corridor in order to have a place to sit, a green space that is there, and the idea of encouraging them at short distances from each other so that there's a real sense that there's a nearby park space in any of these. So what were the results of some of the initial work that we did? And there is more detail in the study itself, but just in that focal area that I talked about that's around the intersection, we're able to get 950 residential units in that. And that can accommodate, just to put it in perspective, it can accommodate all of the intensification target that's been set out of 777 units. I know that Matt mentioned 77 units are already called for, but the 700 remaining can easily be accommodated just in those 4 areas without going anywhere further south or north along the corridor, just to give everybody a sense. And what does that generate? That generates about 1,700 to 1,800 people. It generates about 250,000 square feet or 23,400 square meters of retail and commercial space, and approximately, as I mentioned earlier, 380 jobs with that. So if you want to go on the next one, and just to illustrate what that community intersection, and so you can understand the kind of process that we went through, we were looking at the as you can see sort of in white with the red gives you an idea of the 4-story nature. And then at the intersection, because it's sort of like this important entryway into the village, it frames what will be the future community facility on the northwest side, that we're trying to really emphasize that corner through height, through setting back from the street and showing the notion of a forecourt or a plaza in front of the buildings, just to indicate that this is a special and important community gateway, so to speak, or community focal point, as we've identified it in the corridor study. So that just gives you a sense of that. And you can sort of see on the left-hand side, you can see where some of the property, you can get a sense of the depth of the properties and we've sort of screened out the color just so you can, or grade it out however you want to look at it. And it gives you an idea of what that relationship is. Because I know there were some concerns expressed by council members in the past of how close this was to residential areas. And they're quite far, actually, most of the majority of the areas. Next slide. So when you're developing a corridor like this and you're going from something that is more or less a very, very a simple 4-story vehicular with stretch that's more or less functions as a highway and with ditches on either side, you have to start developing an idea of what could it look like. And this is a very wide, Bayfield Street corridor is very wide. We know from the work that's being done on transportation plans for Bayfield corridor that it's approximately, well, not approximately, but it's 43.6 meters in width. That's very wide in terms of a corridor. So in order to make this more pedestrian friendly, in order for this to function with active transportation and to permit cycling, and hopefully in the future, and that's much further down the road, supporting transit, and at the same time accommodating the vehicles that already travel these spaces. What we try to do is just break down as a demonstration, and you sort of see in the top right-hand corner, where I'm taking this area from and saying here's this stretch here. Again, it could focus, it could extend further south and further north, but I just wanted to get everybody an idea of what it could potentially be. So what are we looking at here? What we're looking at is it's a mirror image on either side, but the idea would be that you've got, like, I'm showing 4-story buildings there with a very robust and deep pedestrian and cycling boulevard, and it's broken up into these extensive sort of a good boulevard that includes sidewalks and street trees and street furniture along the area, then a dedicated separated cycling track. And if anyone is wondering, what do we mean by separated cycling track? We know from the work that our own active transportation team does at WSP that the comfort level and the ability of supporting cycling in communities where there isn't extensive infrastructure for it, other than maybe trails into natural heritage areas. In order to do that, people have to feel safe, and they have to feel that they can make their way around without having to deal with traffic. And understanding what Bayfield's like now, I know that most of you wouldn't consider riding a bike along Bayfield. So how do you introduce these types of facilities into a corridor such as Bayfield? And so by introducing a separated cycling track, and then by also providing, if you go further from the left side, go further right, where you see the street tree and lay-by parking area, we create that additional buffer to the drive lanes that are in either direction. So you still have the same number of drive lanes, and depending on how the MTO and how the region might want to deal with Bayfield in the future, it could be expanded, and you could still get a robust boulevard and cycling area while still accommodating transit and private vehicles. But the idea is, again, it's to introduce the potential and the possibility, and give some sort of a framework or something to envision and something to actually speak to. So I hope everybody, I hope whoever's looking at this likes what they've seen, but I'm obviously open to all sorts of suggestions and comments with respect to it. But what I want to get across is a lot of the ideas that were brought to bear on this particular street section are very current best practice that we've implemented in other parts of Southern Ontario, not with quite the width of corridor that you see here, but we've done it in other locations in much smaller corridors. Next, Matt. So at this point, our preliminary planning and urban design recommendations have been broken down into 3 areas for the corridor. With respect to urban design, as I mentioned earlier, it's to develop corridor-specific urban design guidelines. The other is to generate an urban road section, which I gave you an example of. Is by no means a final thing. It's conceptual. And again, it's meant to generate conversation and to get a reaction, more or less, also from the MTO at some point. And finally, in terms of urban design is, as I mentioned earlier, when we're doing these corridors, although we're not drilling down and getting into specific design level aspects, we still are very cognizant of the fact that we need to ensure that there's green amenity space. And I know that some of you are going to say, well, there's already natural heritage and so, but those are different. That's a different quality of green space. And when you create this corridor that's a lot more urban, that starts to have a lot more, it also has to have some sort of relief, as I mentioned earlier, in order to accommodate the people that will be living there eventually. It will, the idea will be to also suggest that any of these parks where it's possible, or parkettes really is what they're going to be, have access to the natural heritage system. So in this case, you have a system that's really connected and integrated with what's happening along the corridor. In terms of the land use framework, there will be a need to update the land use plan and the secondary plan to address the corridor area as we get closer to the final product. And in particular, the zoning bylaw amendments have to occur in order to specify the permitted uses as they've been indicated in the midhurst secondary plan. So what I mean by that is there's uses indicated in midhurst secondary plan that don't show up in the zoning bylaw, and that's one of those changes that would have to occur in order to allow for some of this other type of development to occur along the corridor itself, and to allow for these uses. And finally, in terms of transportation and servicing, we're obviously supportive of expanding the municipal water and wastewater servicing to all the lots within the corridor, understanding that a good chunk of it will happen over time, but especially in the Bayfield Center character area, we're hoping that at least that's something that can hopefully get started and would should probably be a priority. As I mentioned earlier, we were talking about consolidating the driveway access to all the properties all the way through. And then finally, providing the streetscape and public realm enhancements that I mentioned earlier in terms of the more robust boulevards in order to support active transportation, in terms of safe pedestrian scaled environments and separated cycling zones. Thanks. I think that concludes what lot there, but I hope it was clear. And I turn it over to Greg, I think, at this point. Next slide, Matt.
Can we take a few more questions?
Oh, sorry.
Or are you ready for that? Or
absolutely.
Okay. Great, thank you. A question from Simon Seif. There's a lot of traffic going through our area on the way to Collingwood and Wasaga Beach. Should Springwater consider making use of this traffic? The majority of the available commercial area are not on these roads.
I'm confused as to the majority of the available commercial area are not on these roads.
Maybe we can get Simon to provide a little more detail and we can come back to this question. Okay.
Or I can try to provide some context here because I am familiar with Mr. Seif's comments and the location of where he may be talking about.
Okay.
Correct me if I'm wrong, Moderator Arsenal. I think what Simon is referring to is that there are many roads that are highly traveled that would run, straddling outside of settlement areas, that would run along settlement areas, for example, out in Minising, where you have a heavy volume of traffic that runs through these areas. And I think the origin of his comment is that there would be the availability to go provide some commercial type uses in those areas. And I think from, you know, from a policy perspective, the comment really is that provincial policy looks to aim to direct commercial uses towards your settlement areas and to harness the urban services that are located in those areas to provide amenities to the residents that are located in those areas. So the comment is well taken in that, yes, there's definitely a lot of interest in establishing commercial areas along those corridors because of the volume of traffic and the tourist traffic that goes by. However, due to policy restrictions, the opportunity to establish those are relatively limited and restricted unless you're located within a settlement area or have an existing commercial type approval.
Thank you, Director Spagnol.
Thank you, Director Spagnol. Because again, I'm focusing on the Bayfield corridor itself, but the notion is that over time, the vision for the corridor itself would make people, it'll be different quality of space from what you see further south in Barrie, but it would attract you know, people to actually stop on the way there, just because it will be what we're putting forward as a vision for it would be a much more pedestrian friendly, still accommodating vehicles, still providing parking, but just the way that we compose the street is a little bit different from what's been there and what's there now, obviously.
Okay, another question from Heidi McElwin. She's from Alex Curry Motors. Has the MTO been involved in the corridor study? We understand there is a 14-meter setback between the mutual lot lines.
Brent, can I, Director Spagnol, can I?
Yes, please do go
Put
ahead.
that to you, or?
I just want to let everybody know that that we've lost Mr. Bender, as I understand his email is down. So I'll let John go first, and if I have anything to supplement, I can jump in after.
I'm back now. I just don't have my video again. So sorry, my internet went down, technology being what it is. For those of you who are unaware, we had a stakeholder meeting today, and MTO is part of that meeting. I can say that we have not received any comments from them to date, but they are certainly, you know, a significant stakeholder when it comes to this particular study. I don't want to speak for John or you know, or municipal staff, but you know, the whole intent of this is a visioning exercise. What can this corridor look like, you know, in the future, not tomorrow, but in the future? Is MTO going to be the you know, the maintaining authority over this road for the next 50 years? We don't know. But in order to at least have those conversations, it's important to, you know, study this corridor and understand what, you know, what, from a municipal standpoint, what they want to have, and then use that as a basis for discussion.
And if I could add to that, I do have correspondence from the MTO, and we did receive correspondence that they will be providing their comments in writing. They're well aware of the corridor study, and they're well aware of our official plan review process. So MTO will definitely be involved as we move through this process.
Thank you.
And we also know, just if I can just add, can you hear me?
Yes.
Moderator?
Yes,
Oh,
go
you
ahead,
can.
John.
Okay. I just wanted to add that sometimes there's concern expressed because we're showing this on what is currently designated as a highway or is used as a highway. I just want to explain to everybody, this type of development occurs all over Southern Ontario. And, you know, the MTO quite often over a process, but again, we have to provide them with something to look at to even consider, considers such urbanization or changes based on information that's provided and based on the kinds of development that they've seen in other parts of Southern Ontario. So just in case there's a concern there in terms of that. And again, we're as I mentioned earlier, or as Greg mentioned, a lot of this, it's a visioning exercise, and we're trying to get across what could work in terms of a center that's that could support existing residents and new residents and support the intensification that's there. So when we're showing it, yeah, we are showing a much different reality than what's there now. But it's not pie in the sky. These types of changes occur in different places, and I guess the example I can give further south is Highway 7. That's over the last 3-4 decades. It's changed a lot, and but that's why we're saying this is long-term stuff.
Thank you. So a question from B. McDonald. In terms of gentle intensification, would this consider a reduction of lot size that is permitted in the current zoning bylaw, especially in areas that are partly serviced? Are we looking at reducing the minimum lot size to allow intensification in the minor settlement areas?
So this is really more a question for you, is it not, Matt? Is there not, this isn't a corridor?
Yeah, this sounds like more of a general intensification strategy question. So these recommendations are directly related to the official plan, which is separate from the zoning bylaw, but gives direction to the zoning bylaw. So the policies would sort of establish a principle that somewhat higher density uses could be permitted in those existing areas. And how that gets then translated into the zoning bylaw could be through something like reduced property size limits, but not necessarily. So sometimes what you see are zoning bylaws that require, let's say, a minimum frontage for semi-detached units that can't be accommodated because the minimum lot size in general is too wide or something like that. But we are seeing different kinds of residential building types these days, where you have sort of wider semis or wider townhouse units in neighborhoods. So it doesn't necessarily mean smaller lot sizes or smaller frontages. One of the other factors that we were considering in this is what's the impact on on-street parking, or like the distance between driveways, because you don't want a road to just be all driveways and garages along the front of it. So there are considerations for that as well. So I would say that just at this stage, what we're doing is we're looking at those broader, higher level official plan policies that establish a principle and types of land uses that would be permitted. We aren't specifically looking at things like frontages and lot sizes that would be implemented in the zoning bylaw at this point.
And just further to that, Matt, it's a good question. You'll note in Matt's presentation, as well as in one of my responses, that intensification would only be within the delineated built-up area, not in just what you've mentioned, minor settlement areas or just other settlement areas where there's partial services. Intensification should be directed to full services.
Yeah.
Thank you. A question from Stephanie. And Stephanie, I'll just ask if you can include your full name and your municipal address. Just if you want to type that out separately for us, that'd be great, just so we have can make note of that. She's asking, in the intensification areas, will there be any particular architectural controls or regulations to ensure a particular aesthetic? Thanks.
Well, with respect to that, depending on what you mean by intensification areas. If you mean along the core, let me roll back a little bit. In terms of urban design guidelines and some architectural design guidelines, not controls but guidelines, they already exist in the midhurst secondary plan, and that covers off the municipality in a general level, or covers off the midhurst village in a general level completely. What we will be doing is developing some more specific urban design guidelines for the corridor itself. And the idea would be that the other areas that are within the settlement areas that have been identified would still come under the review of the existing guidelines. In terms of architectural controls, where you have a company providing that service or overseeing that, again, that's, I think Greg had mentioned earlier in the presentation, that it's something that we would discuss with the municipality further with staff to understand how that might work. Or
That's right, John. And just I think Stephanie mentioned as a follow-up that she's just referring to along the corridor. So I think you answered that one.
Yeah. And finally, there isn't anything to preclude, quite often, just so everybody understands, architectural controls are a lot of times introduced by the developer themselves. They're not even introduced by the municipality, but it's introduced by developers themselves when they're trying to ensure, where they have multiple builders in a community, that they ensure some parity in terms of quality and design and materials used. So just so that everybody understands that.
Thank you. T. Barlow, owner of 742 Bayfield Street, given Mr. Spagnell's answer on the buffer area near the city of Barrie boundary, is it correct to assume that this study did not consider the merits of development in this area?
If you're looking at the corridor, we were sticking to what is within the settlement boundary for Midhurst. And as I mentioned earlier, if they were identified in that schedule as being environmental areas, they were probably left out. Or if they were south of the settlement area, they were probably left, or north of it, left out of the corridor study.
Thank you. Helma Hahn would like to know, he would be interested to know how the consolidation of vehicle entrances on Bayfield might be accomplished. Would this be something like a single entrance onto a boulevard that would provide access to multiple properties?
Yeah, that would be the intention. One of the things I haven't been able sort of to show is just very simply, how you would have a veneer of buildings along Bayfield, and then you could get one access. In many instances, we are introducing almost the idea of it being almost the size of a small local road, but that would allow access to the rear parking areas for multiple properties. And so that would be the sense. And the distances aren't really great, so you can actually do that. The idea would be just to be able to take at least 2 to 4 properties and have a singular access, as opposed to having multiple access points. But that's basically how we were dealing with it. Also, it helps when you're trying to accommodate contiguous parking behind buildings. It's easier to get that sort of consolidation than if you're trying to do it in the front sometimes. So that is the idea, that you would have the introduction of they wouldn't just be small sort of driveways. The idea was that you'd be able to come in and come out of these areas through what would be essentially the size of a small local road.
Great, thank you. Simon Seif at 1968 George Johnson Road. It's asking, are there plans to have sewers in the Bayfield corridor?
Director Spaniel, do you want to like speak to that, or should I just talk about the corridor study?
Thank you. I mean, the plan will have to be that the corridor is serviced based on the densities that we're talking about, the types of uses. There is no other way really for this corridor to come into existence through development unless servicing is made available. Those types of services would be subject to, an environmental assessment process and things of that nature. So a simple yes, services will be required in order to facilitate and support this type of development and what's envisioned through the study.
And it's an obvious recommendation that we've made early on in terms of that. So.
T. Barlow, on behalf of the owner of 1050 Bayfield Street. I believe you said you will be making corrections in the area of 1050 Bayfield Street. Can you just confirm, please, that this is your intent?
Is 1050 Bayfield Street, is that Jasmina's property, or is it?
I'm not sure.
My apologies. That
we can ask to provide more information.
Yeah, because if it is, as I said, that's an oversight on our part, and in particular myself, because I thought we had included that within the boundary. So
okay,
the boundary will be adjusted. If that's the property, the boundary will be adjusted, and we will I checked my AutoCAD drawing, and we actually had done a concept for it. So that's what's kind of disappointing, and not, it's created some stress, and there was no intention on doing that. If that's the correct property, sorry.
So I just see Jasmina has responded that I don't think that's her property. She's saying hers is 1060.
Oh, well, and 1050 would be the adjacent property to the south.
So T. Barlow is stating it's Paul Sadlin property.
So John, let me go back to the map.
Go back to the map.
So 1050 and 1060. Can you see my cursor?
Yep, I can see that. Yeah, those two will be, that's what I'm saying, that's going to get shifted over, but not obviously into the green, because I know there's a lot of property further south. I think that is also part of the same property owner that wouldn't be included. So it would only be that portion. And again, when everybody sees the study, I am not showing concepts based on individual property lines. I'm trying to show how the corridor could develop over time in terms of assembly, in terms of how that works together. So if any of you go looking for that later on, trying to see how your particular property was dealt with, you'll be happy or be disappointed to see that it's trying to show, we're trying to show how this could be developed in a contiguous manner. So it's about the way it was described to me by one of my old mentors was the idea is to make the best plan. So, and that's what we're trying to do. But yes, it will be included if that answers the question. So it's not just Jasmina's property, but the property adjacent just to the south.
Thank you. And a follow-up from Jasmina. She says she's impressed with your drawings, asking if you would not have an opposition from the MTO.
We're gonna find out, Jasmina. We're gonna find out. But as I said earlier, I don't know if you caught or if this question came before I mentioned it. MTO has decommissioned portions of highways quite often throughout Southern Ontario. I think my transportation team had given me some like 44 examples. So I don't have them all here, but it's not unheard of. Things change over time. highways become, important major roads within municipalities, and then they become highways again further south or further north. But the idea is that we start with this character area, as you can see on the screen now, that you see encircled in the purple line, and hoping that we can get some of that implemented for that portion. So, and again, it's a framework, it's a vision. If we don't provide something for comments or why it's good or why it's not good, then there's no point in having a discussion. We have to be able to test things and also find out from the MTO, whether it's something that what their concerns would be with respect to what we're proposing.
Thank you. Another question from Tiziano Zaghi. How can you develop a community hub, a people place, walkable people place, when the spine is a 4-lane arterial road with an 80-kilometer speed limit? Unless the function and character of Bayfield Street is significantly changed, the best you're going to get is highway commercial uses. The graphics shown in terms of road cross-section are reasonable if you are in the GTA along roads like Highway 7 corridor. An observation. I have lived in Midhurst for 20 years. During that time, 2 small commercial developments have occurred at the intersection of Bayfield and Carson Road.
Okay. And the answer to that is it is a change of the character. And that is one of the things that we're talking about. And that's why the section is so important to show what that might be. The section is important to show that what's being envisioned is a change from the typical highway commercial, a change from that type of experience to something that's much more urban. That's why we started initially by speaking specifically to the focal intersection, because the idea is there's already some activity there, but if there's the introduction of the future community hub and recreational center on the one side, and we start to get that mixed use intersection, the idea with that almost acts as planting the seed, having a catalyst for what happens along Bayfield from there. So I think the best way I can explain is one of the recommendations going to be is that we can't have development willy-nilly everywhere along the corridor because it is quite long. And so the intention, at least this preliminary level, is to recommend that we have a much more focused approach on where that development and growth can occur, and show how that might be permitted further north and south as time goes on. So to answer the question, the idea is, yeah, we are looking for a change of the function and character. This isn't an 80-kilometer. Imagine, Mr. Zaghi, that you've got, there are lots of communities where you come to where you're slowing right down, you're along the highway, and then the complexion of the area changes. There's street boulevards, there's that median. So the idea, all those things are supposed to act as, what urban designers would call visual cues. It tells you that the area gets more compressed. It's not one big open space. So these visual cues are all meant to make you slow down too. It's not just a case of putting up a sign that says, 40 or 50. It's actually, the idea is that you're doing it through design as well as slowing down traffic. And that is the idea of when people are concerned about that quite often, but the idea is, if you don't do that, if you don't turn this into a quality pedestrian area, you can't make the corridor happen. It will, as you said, it will continue to be a highway. But that's why we're trying to create a vision and a framework of how the character of that, at least initially, the portion of the corridor could be transformed over time. Because as I said, it's 4 kilometers long. We know we're not going to be able to do it overnight, and I understand 20 years. And I worked in in Midhurst about 12, 13 years ago on the secondary plan itself. And things have changed a lot since I worked on that the last time around. That time around, we never talked about this corridor in the way that we're talking about it now. But a lot of things have changed, and there are, as you well know, Midhurst is actually it's grown and has more residential development. What it needs, though, is it needs this sort of center, and that's what we're envisioning and trying to plan for with what we're putting forward in the study.
Exactly right, John. And just to further on that is, this is a priority corridor for the township. It is a priority given its complexity and how it could evolve over time. If you don't do a study like this, then you'll never understand how it could evolve. And certainly the establishment of the community hub is as John mentioned, the catalyst for getting for almost incenting development to happen along here, because it does take a significant effort on behalf of the municipality to do that. Certainly, if MTO were to control this corridor in the same way it has over the past, there are significant constraints to enabling and implementing that vision. But it's a starting point. It's a starting point for that conversation.
Great. So this question is not necessarily related to the Bayfield corridor, but from Sean Mason. Why is 716 St. Vincent not in the intensification consideration, given it is not the same situation as the larger agricultural pieces around Springwater and is a small buffer piece surrounded on 3 sides by residential and 1 side golf course?
So I might suggest that that question be submitted separately in writing, and then we can take a deeper look at it and provide a more detailed response.
Or sorry, Matt, I think I can
sure.
chime in here. The property in question at 617 St. Vincent Street is located within that greenbelt area that we discussed earlier and that Stephanie asked the question about. So the property is not located within the built boundary, and the intensification strategy really facilitates speaks to the built boundaries within Midhurst and Elmville. So that is why that specific property has not been included in the discussion relative to intensification.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. And Yana Zane from 17 Woods Drive in Elmville. When you performed your study for commercial retail space of the Bayfield corridor, have you gathered any input from current Midhurst residents in terms of what they would like to see created in the space in question and what they think their needs are?
Yeah, that's a good question, Yana. We weren't getting into that sort of detail. Matt, I don't know if there's anything that you have from Urban Metrics, but in terms of what we were doing with the corridor study is showing the potential for gross floor retail space, not getting into the details of, I mean, that's not part of that's not a scope. That's not part of the scope of my particular study in terms of the corridor. But it was more or less to show what was the potential was for retail along the corridor itself.
I might be able to respond to that in some detail, given Watson's work, John.
Thank you.
I'm certainly no expert when it comes to the work that Watson did, but I remember
Apologies,
them.
Watson. Yeah, sorry about that.
I remember them saying that the intent for the commercial space along Bayfield is not the, I guess, large format retail types of uses. It's meant for more of the, local community types of uses. To serve the community, not to serve outlying areas. But that being said, there's going to be a significant amount of flexibility to allow, the municipality to carry forward and determine what sort of types of commercial uses are appropriate in this area. We're just identifying the type of, the amount of space needed and how it might be configured. But recognizing some of the diagrams that John discussed, it's meant for the more smaller shops, to serve the local area, and it's not a regional area, so to speak.
Yeah, definitely that was sort of the intent, that we're looking at a finer grain. We're not just talking about, large commercial, like we're not talking about anything that's like further south. The vision is that it's a very different experience. And as I said earlier, one of the important parts of the Bayfield Center character area is developing it for existing residents and for new residents. So the idea is that you have a critical mass of people that can help support a lot of the retail that could be generated by these developments. So, but in terms of what I mean, that's in terms of what's preferred or what's looking for, that wasn't something that I was dealing with.
Great, thank you. And one other question here from T. Barlow, and he's a lawyer from Baskin Law Firm.
Mm-hmm.
On behalf of Paul Sadlin, owner of 742 Bayfield Street. On the decision not to include the area along Bayfield Street near the City of Barrie boundary in the study, why would you not have included the whole Bayfield Street corridor and let the process exclude any properties that were unsuitable after considering what development applications may be intended by owners in that area?
Well, I think I explained it earlier. There were a couple of decisions that were made and assumptions, and they're not strange assumptions. They were very simply, we only looked at the corridor that was within the built boundary of Midhurst, and then we took out areas that had contiguous environmental space, environmental area 1 and 2 that were identified in the secondary plan. So the idea was to, as part of this, was to identify at a very high level which properties could be considered for the corridor and for potential intensification. It's not meant to exclude anything. What we're doing is we're dealing with those two aspects of what's not in the natural heritage system and what is within the Midhurst settlement boundary. So that's how that was determined. The stuff that's further south from that is not something that would have been included because it wasn't part of a scope of the work that we were doing here. As I've mentioned before, with a lot of stuff, it doesn't, in terms of potential development, always my experience in the past has been, if an environmental impact study can get more specific and speak to it more specifically, because again, we're doing this at a very high level from the perspective of taking the existing mappings that the municipality has. If you can do more detailed EIS and you can show that you're within the settlement boundary and there's an area that can be developed, I can't see how that would be precluded. But that's the only answer I can give you with respect to that.
Thank you. That was the last question, but we'll give the attendees just a minute if there's any other questions that they'd like to submit before we move on.
Moderator Arsenault, I realized I was doing planning speak. What I meant by EIS, for those who aren't familiar with the term, it's an environmental impact study or statement with respect to properties. Sometimes they're done in order to identify, well, not sometimes, they're done in order to identify what the limits are of the property and natural heritage, or what we call no-touch natural areas.
Thanks for clarifying that, John. And I just want to mention that anyone who's listening in by telephone or live streaming, they can submit questions or comments in writing to the planning department by mail or email, planning@springwater.ca, after this meeting if they didn't get a chance to get their questions answered at this time. Okay, I don't see any more questions. And do we want to move on? Greg, do you have some closing statements?
Certainly, yeah. I think we'll just focus on the next steps, and I think that that'll sort of close out the meeting unless there's additional questions after I walk through the 7 steps here.
Okay, great. Thank you.
So you're welcome. So just to summarize where we are and where we're going to be going, you know, we would certainly appreciate any comments as it relates to the background papers or the official plan process by March 12th, because what we want to do is we want to finalize the background reports by March 26th in order to bring them back to council for to finalize that particular part of the process, and in order for us to move forward in drafting the official plan. We're looking to do that by July with subsequent engagement of council, stakeholders, and yourselves over the summer. Once we gather all the input, we'll consider that and finalize the official plan in the fall. Following that, there's going to be another set of meetings, including a statutory public meeting, which we're looking to do in December with council adoption, ideally in late 2021. So certainly there's a number of other opportunities for engagement for your input, and we'll certainly look forward to seeing you all again over the summer to talk to you about the draft official plan. And I think with that, you've got the links below, which are again on the township's website. And with that, that concludes my presentation, or our presentation.
Thank you. Thank you for all the attendees for joining.